All right, hello everyone, good morning. Thank you for joining me on the second day of Copenhagen Developers Festival. I'm Adrienne Braganza Tacke, and today I'd like to talk to you about variables of the Veracious variety. Now, I really like to use the website thesaurus.com, so you'll see that there will be lots of other words in here that might mean some other things because we want to be succinct. And so let's get started. Great, clicker is working. So who here has heard this quote? It has been seen time and time again. There are only two really difficult things or hard things in computer science. That is cache invalidation and naming things. Who has heard this quote before from Phil Karlton? And who tends to agree that naming things, if the clicker works, is really, really difficult? That's why you're here, right? Yes, so this is exactly what this talk is about. So if this was not what you were intending, I will not be hurt. Go ahead and go to another talk. But this is what we will focus on today, naming things. Specifically, we're going to talk about why is naming so important? We have a gut feeling why this is important and what we do about it, but sometimes we can't really articulate what that actually means, of why it is important. Then we'll also talk about why it's difficult and what really makes it so hard for us to choose the best names. After that, we'll go into the 3 C's of what I consider great variables, and those are tips and guidelines that we can finally set for ourselves to help us create better variable names. And lastly, we'll go through some variables to see how we can put this into practice. So the first thing, why is naming important? Well, naming is a way of placing order in our world. It's a way to help us differentiate things. It's a way for us to see our world and make sure that we know what we're talking about. There's so many different things in the world, and we want to know what we're talking about when we talk to you, when we talk to our family, when we discuss things, when I teach you something. We want to know what it is that we're talking about. And so when we are naming things, take, for example, this cat that was very soon adopted by me. We place names on important things, right? Or inanimate objects, cars, toys, I don't know. But sometimes we also choose names for animals. And so when you first receive this picture, or when you're thinking about adopting an animal like I did, I saw this photo, and then I said, okay, what am I going to name this thing? Because this is going to soon be my pet. And when you start thinking about the different names, you go, okay, maybe I think Oreo, because this is a tuxedo cat, it's black and white, it's something cute, and when I think of an Oreo, those attributes remind me of something happy, like an Oreo. So maybe I choose this name because this is the meaning I place behind that name. Or maybe I choose the name Domino because this is apparently a very popular name for tuxedo cats. There's black and white. Maybe you go and be very direct and say Tux. It's a very clear name because that is the breed of the cat. But in the end, I ended up going with Onyx because it was a little bit more unique. I would know that is specifically my cat, and this was the name that the foster gave her, and she ended up recognizing, and so I chose Onyx. And if you'll believe it or not, when we choose names, we also do the same kind of method of thinking, ideally when it comes to our kids. So take, for example, my own name. Who here has asked their parents where they got the name, how did they choose their name? How did they end up giving their name? You probably have some really interesting story. There's like a warrior meaning behind it, or there's like a really special person in your family that you've been named after. I asked my mom the same question. I'm like, how did you choose Adrienne? I mean, in the beginning I didn't like it, but I ended up growing to really like the name. And no joke, you've heard it here first at Copenhagen Developers Festival. The reason I got my name Adrienne, spelled this way, is, quote, my mom was walking through the department store and she saw a particular designer tag of Adrienne Vittadini. And so that is how I got my name. So I'm like, thankfully you didn't choose anything else that was a little bit weirder or a little bit. – So there you go. That's how we got my name. Now, when we talk about scientifically naming things, we have to be a little bit more straightforward. We need to have a process behind it. We need to have some rules in place because we can't just willy-nilly choose a name based on what we like. Although in scientific nomenclature, if you are the first one to discover an organism, you do have some say in what that name is going to be. But in science, we specifically choose a very specific process for how we name things. This is extremely important because we want to prevent confusion. Being very specific allows any scientist in the world to know exactly what organism you are talking about. Could you imagine talking to any developer and saying, this is what I mean on that particular variable? No matter where you are in the world, you could have a conference like this and you'd all immediately understand. That's what's so cool about being very, very specific. And so we should take a note from the scientists, our fellow scientists, because in theory, we are computer scientists by occupation. So being very, very specific. This is important. Why? Who here in this room is also called Adrienne, just by chance? Are you kidding me? That is awesome. I don't even have to go to my second and third example. Thank you, Adrienne. So there's another Adrienne in the room. And if I were to yell out Adrienne or somebody yells out Adrienne in the room, both of us are probably going to look at that person because it's not specific enough. We need a more specific identifier. We need something maybe like a last name. Do you mind sharing your last name? Grau. So unless someone says Adrienne Grau or Adrienne Braganza Tacke, then we don't know who we are referring to. We don't know who we're talking about. And so this is, again, coming back to the point of being very specific allows us to know exactly what we are trying to convey. This was not the case in the 1700s. Before the 1700s, we would have some organisms or things that were floating around, and people would use different names for them. So for example, this picture here, maybe there are some biologists here, maybe they know what this is, but in the past, you would have people saying, oh, this was a white oak. In their observations in daily life, they might have described or taken notes or talked about this particular tree and called it a white oak. On the other hand, somebody else somewhere else may have said, oh, this is a rounded oak. Maybe their particular tree was a little bit rounder, or for whatever reason decided to use that identifier. And then yet another person might say a rough oak. These are all three variations of what this particular tree has been called in the past and has been misidentified. So this is actually Quercus alba, which is the white oak. But to make matters worse, so knowing all of these different identifiers that are now floating around to potentially describe this particular tree, you now also have different trees being named white oak. So maybe somebody else goes, oh, this is a strange white oak that I am seeing, not knowing that that is not a white oak, and yet using the same name to identify that particular tree, even though it's wrong. So laying out this foundation, we see that all of this misidentification and misnaming things leads to a lot of confusion, and that's not far off from what we can experience as developers in programming. We do have your neighbor to the northeast to thank, Carl Linnaeus. He is a Swedish naturalist who has been credited with giving us the unique naming structure that we have for every organism today. So you may have heard of binomial naming. My clicker is not working with me today. And so every organism in the world, you can thank him, Carl, for having a binomial name. Thank you, Carl. So having a binomial name gets us to that specificity. Having that binomial name allows any scientist in the world to know exactly what they are talking about. So when you take a look at this, let's see, let me go back here because I can't see. So in a binomial name, you have two parts, bi meaning two. We have the genus, and we have the species modifier. The genus is kind of like the top-level family of organized characteristics that one might group a certain set of things into. And then you have a species modifier, which is like an adjective. So if we were to relate this to the example earlier, Adrienne would be the family or the genus name, and then the species modifier would be Grau or Braganza Tacke to further identify and be specific about what we're talking about. And so for us, Homo sapiens, this is our human name. This is our binomial name. And this is why it is incredibly cool, incredibly important to be super, super specific. This is why it is so important. So, okay, we know that it is important, Adrienne. Why is it difficult? So again, we may have this gut feeling in our stomach, but sometimes we may not be able to articulate it. But I will go through some reasons of why this may be difficult. First, guidance on naming is mostly syntactical. When you look through all of the different materials on the internet, in papers, in books, there are a lot of things telling us how our variable names should look. So when we get these kinds of rules for ourselves, we have things around casing, right? So they tell us what case do you use, when do you use it, when do you not use it, and they tell us how our variable looks. Or we get a lot of rules around length. So make sure it is not over or under a specific character count or word count. Make sure you're not abbreviating. This is something I do agree with. And make sure you're not using really, really short identifier names, or even the letter I when we iterate through loops, which stands for iterator. That is something that is still very debated because as programmers, we see it all the time. And so that might be one thing where you could argue and say it is so well known in the industry that you could get away with it, especially if you are using it within the context of a loop. But I would still argue just make it more descriptive, use something that actually describes what you're iterating through. So with these kinds of syntactical pieces of guidance, we get rules like this. Avoid kebab case since it clashes with the subtraction syntax in some particular languages. Or use camel case specifically for variable names. And I want to take note here, make note that, of course, there are coding conventions and language conventions and framework conventions, and we should all definitely stick to that. But even looking through those, we get a lot of rules that are like this, that says use this particular case or use this particular convention. Same thing with length. Use short identifier names for short scopes. So again, going back to that iterator variable, if you're only going to use it when you iterate through something in a very short scope, it's okay for the name to be short, which I don't agree with. And keep name length to a 25-character maximum. So there are papers that talk about all different kinds of studies. What is the proper amount of words that you should use in a variable? In one paper that's been cited, it said anything that's longer than 7 letters is considered long. Think about all the concepts we have to convey. I think we're always going to have really, really long variable names with that particular metric. So having only syntactical guidance, having only rules that say this is how our variable names should look, the meaning behind the names, the words that we choose to actually call our variables, the semantics of how we choose variable names are less found on the internet and less found unless you have a really good mentor or you yourself are making sure to teach that down to your team. There is not a lot to be found on what to choose and how to choose the names for your variables. It is very, very much lacking. And within this realm of semantics, we get the rules like this. Use meaningful descriptive names. Try making identifiers self-documenting. Names should be non-ambiguous. Okay, we know what these are, but even these particular words, when we add them to our rules, we don't know what those are. Tell me what those look like. What is meaningful? What is descriptive? What is non-ambiguous to me might not be non-ambiguous to you. what is descriptive to some might be not descriptive to others. So these kinds of rules that are not as explicit as the syntactical rules that we have are not as helpful when we are trying to decide what to name our variables. And not only that, to make matters even more difficult, even if we do decide to find identifiers that have these characteristics, names that are meaningful, descriptive, self-documenting, non-ambiguous, that's not enough. Because variable names can be all of those things, but they also have to be correct. Who here has seen a variable that was very, very explicit, yet returned not what it said? Who here has seen a variable that said, I'm going to give you this in a particular type implementation, but it actually didn't give it to you in that type? So even though we may have the most clear name possible in terms of what it is trying to be, it still needs to be correct. And even that is highly debated. So what is correct? This is kind of a hot take here, but correct, you would assume there is only one way to say correct is correct, but not in variable naming. And here's why. So there's this notion of homonyms, same words, different meaning. And if we're going to be specific, because we are computer scientists and we want to be specific in the things that we are talking about, there are further branches that we can be more granular with when we're talking about homonyms. Specifically, homographs, which literally translates to same writing. And this just means that they have the same spelling of a word, but they have a different meaning. And we have homophones, which are literally same sound. And so these homophones are same pronunciation, but a different meaning. So when we look at these homonyms that exist in, let's say, the English language, you can kind of tell that it's going to get a little bit trippy here. So in English, we have the word duck. Like, I took my pet duck to the Gucci store. Duck, the animal, the noun, the thing, the living thing. Or duck. Duck your head before going down the stairs or while going down the stairs. You're physically moving down, moving your head down so that you don't hit the stairs. Duck. Or take the word rock. There was a great rock band last night. It's describing what type of band, the genre of music. Or almost 4 tons of solid rock had to be removed to build this tunnel or to build this skyscraper. Rock, the actual material that had to be removed. Having homographs in place presents a lot of different issues, and we'll talk about those in a moment. Homophones, on the other hand, are the ones where they have same pronunciation, but different meanings. So again, in English, we have right and right, as in turn right at the next intersection, or like what I'm doing right now, they said write a book. Write a book, they said. Write, to write something. And finally, last example here for homophones, there is hour and hour. There is you are with me for the hour, whether you like it or not. And what do you mean, our cake? This is what I tell my husband every time I order cake, and he says, this is our cake. I said, what do you mean, our cake? So, homophones. Homographs, same writing, same spelling, different meaning. Homophones, same pronunciation, different meaning, same sound, literally translated from the Latin. So, homonyms. It's not just in English, there's also in Danish. So when I Googled what homonyms were in Danish, I chose a few, and I tried for the life of me to see what the different pronunciations are, but maybe this is one of the homophones, because cheers and bowl sound the same. Is that true? Skål and skål. Skål? Skål or skål? Skål, skål. Okay. So there. Or is the J a Y sound or a G sound? Is it Jul? Jul. And Christmas is also Jul? So how do you determine what you're talking about? Context? It's like German. German's difficult too. Danish is difficult too. So Jul. Jul and Jul. Again, do not know what you're talking about unless you have some context, unless you have some specificity. And even in Tagalog, which is one of my native languages, you have tayo and tayo. So tayo, when you pronounce it that way, tayo means to stand, or tayo means us. And the other word, there are many of these, but basa and basa, if something is wet, you say it's basa. And if you want to read something, you might say, babasa ako ng isang libro. Very American accent. Marlag is gonna, if Marlag is in the crowd, she's gonna be like, oh my gosh, you have a very American accent. I try. So, homonyms, not limited to the English language, and maybe not as much of a problem in programming because a lot of programming is written in English. Nonetheless, your fellow developers who are writing might have multiple languages in their head. So even if you are writing in English, you may have some words like this that take up some of that cognitive load in their head that make it a little bit harder for them to distinguish what they're talking about. Or maybe you are writing in this particular language, and so now you have to take that into account when you are identifying, comprehending, and choosing names. So now we get to synonyms. We have homonyms, now we have synonyms, which are the worst of the two. So synonyms are different words, same meaning. And if we go here, let's see if I can increase here. No, it's just going to do the main screen. So again, thesaurus.com. I am in love with this tool. It helps me choose different words. It helps me be more precise. But this is also an issue because let's say we take the name count, which is something very common that we probably have to do in a function or have to name something. Count, to me, when I think of the word count, I think of a very specific notion of tallying or counting and enumerating through numbers. But if I ask somebody else count, they might pick any one of these other concepts that may be related to it. So maybe counting is specifically adding in their heads, or even counting is something to consider. Does this count or does it not count? Or having importance, that counts. So there are all of these different concepts tied to this particular word, and that is the problem with identifying and choosing names, is because of all of these concepts. Bless you. So we have names. Count, the words that we end up choosing as our identifiers. These are the variable names that we end up putting into code. And if we took that example count, you'd say some of the two concepts there out of the many. Summation, which is a concept that is associated to the word count, or a perception, or a nuance, or a connotation. There's all these different things that may be tied to a particular word. We call that a concept. Count is also enumeration of numbers. It has this concept along with many others. I'm just simplifying this example for the moment. Now let's say we chose one of those synonyms and we decided to use tally. Tally has its own set of concepts. It has keep count, right? Or it has to mark, because when you tally something, you tally and you make a mark every time you are keeping count or marking something up. You tally something. Where it gets really, really frustrating is tally also has the notion of summation. So again, depending on who is using the word, depending on what concepts are in that developer's head, you may be considering one set of concepts, and you may be considering another set of concepts. And that is exactly what this particular paper, Concise and Consistent Naming by Florian and Marcus, it was published in 2006. They actually published another paper called Concise and Consistent Naming 10 years later. And the funny thing is, they found that even with all of the findings, which some of them I am showing you today, they have not changed in application. We are still having trouble identifying variables. We are still having trouble comprehending them. We're still having trouble getting to the ideal state of having every single name that we talk about be very explicit about what we're trying to convey. And I'm going to show you a couple figures that they have shown when it comes to the problems of synonyms and homonyms. So this first one, A. Homonyms pose an obstacle for program comprehension because we have to take all of those elements into account. So when we take the homonyms, whether they are different, whether they're homophones or homographs, we increase the size of the concepts that we must hold in our head when we are either reading the code or writing the code. We say, this could mean this, or this could mean this, and if we are not specific enough, for the next developer who does decide to read that name, will have the same problem. Comprehension becomes way more difficult because of all of the different concepts they have to take into account. In their figure B in their paper, synonyms unnecessarily increase the domain of N and the relation R, raising the learning effort of the language used. So again, similar to the last example, when you add homonyms and synonyms together, I want to say cinnamon, synonyms together, you are just continuing to expand the domain with which you keep in your head. All of the different concepts, all of the different connotations, all of the different meanings, those all go into your head, whether you think about it or not. So when you are reading a variable name that is ambiguous or is not very explicit or clear, when you have this domain space of all the different concepts that it might be related to, that goes into your comprehension. You are reading it and you are thinking, oh, maybe summation, oh, maybe enumeration, oh, maybe to keep count. When if you had just chosen a more specific name or a more clear name, you can remove some of those concepts. You can be way more explicit, and you can and make that cognitive load a little bit less because you know exactly what you're talking about. The third figure here is when encountering name N1, so like count or tally, all the N's here, the words, the names, the reader must take concepts C1, C2 into account. So this is exactly what we just talked about. And their ideal state is that we get to this, that for every name that we choose, we explicitly convey one and only one concept. This is a very, very wild dream. This is why 10 years later they say this is still not really happening because it's somewhat very difficult to find that. First, even if you chose look through all the dictionary words that we have, we tend to use a lot of compound names, so we choose two or more words to convey the concept that we're trying to talk about in programming. And sometimes with the problems of synonyms, homonyms, and not being accurate with what we are choosing, that just, again, increases the confusion on why we can't name our variable names correctly. And just to put the cherry on top for why why naming is difficult, in a different paper called How Developers Choose Names, I believe Felian, who's here, also spoke about this. When 334 developers were asked to choose 47 variable names, the median probability that 2 would choose the same was just 6.9%. Other than being a really nice percentage, it is incredibly telling that with all of these issues today, when choosing words, that we are not getting to the right words. So, now understanding why it is difficult and why it is important, how do we actually choose better variable names then? How do we get to these one name, one concept type of ideas? This is where I come to the 3 C's of great naming, and this was heavily inspired, again, by the concise and consistent naming paper, so I don't promise to take credit for all of it, but I do take credit for how I'm going to explain it to you. Consistent, concise, correct. There's variations of this guidance that is shared everywhere, but in order for us to get to this understanding, consistent to me means the identifier needs to be unique enough to convey the concept. So whenever you needed to do, let's say, a variable rename, or you needed to find a particular name throughout all of the methods or all of the classes in your program, you are able to distinctly find that particular name and be sure that that is the very explicit concept that you're either trying to rename, to change, to refactor. This is the thing that you are talking about. So a good example of this is when you say account number. Somewhere it's number, somewhere it's account num, somewhere it's account number, somewhere it's ACTNUM. It's these types of things where when I say consistent, it has to be the same identifier enough to uniquely convey the concept. Concise. The identifier needs to accurately convey the concept and minimize the related concept space as much as possible. So while there is a way to choose a name, there is a way to be too generic about it. For example, the one they give in the paper is a function that would transform. They called the initial variable name transformation. And while that is actually concise, it wasn't concise enough, because what is actually happening in the function was permutation. Permutation is a more concise version of a transformation. So generally speaking, transformation can mean many different things. Permutation specifically means this particular way to calculate. So by choosing a more concise name, by using thesaurus.com and getting to the essence of what it is that you're trying to convey, you can help your fellow developers limit that concept space that is being held in their head and limit the possible confusion that may ensue when you are talking about a particular variable name. And finally, correct. So remember, even if we had meaningful descriptive names, even if they were concise, if they're not correct, they're useless to us. So correct, the identifier needs to convey what is actually being assigned. So with these 3 C's, these are a bit more explicit. These are closer to the syntactical rules that we've been given, and some hold as the, law for us to use. But when it comes to the semantics of how we name our variables, these 3 should very much guide you in the right direction every time that you are going. And so specifically with the correct, we now want to go to variable variables, because this has all been in theory so far. So let's actually see how we would go through and name these things. And we'll start with what I consider the low-hanging fruit, the easiest thing that we all should be doing if we are not by now, and that is how we name Booleans. So Booleans should and can only beat one of 2 values, true or false. They need to answer a question, yes or no. And when you name your Boolean, they need to give you this answer. They need to read in this way. They need to convey that it is going to give you a yes or a no. And so with those things, we've come up with some conventions where Booleans are something. They could be an upgrade, so is upgrade, or is approval, or is pro member. They might do something. So this does not mean you take does and then add the word. This is, what is the action that you are trying to convey? Does it allow white space? It does will update? Did it restart? These all are also in the affirmative, because whenever you have to negate the question and you read that in code, it's not fun to do a double negative. That just increases the cognitive load in your head of, okay, what am I? It is not restarting. No, wait, it is not active? No. So whenever you do try to name Booleans, it's usually easier to read when you do it in the affirmative. And finally, something else is it has something. It has more than one warning, or it has multiple discounts, or has exception. So Booleans should all be following these types of guidelines. These should be much more clear and easier to read, and should also more clearly convey what you are trying to assess. So if we were to name a Boolean, and the condition was we needed to return true if at least one user is active, what would that name be? This is the code that it would be, so that something there is what we're trying to name. So in one of the examples I found, someone said, is users active? So it would read, is users active? It just sounds wrong, right? It's grammatically incorrect. It's not actually true. The condition we're trying to find is if at least one user, so this kind of is confusing because you say, is users active? So we're gonna go not with that one because it's already grammatically incorrect. We have is at least one user active. It's a little bit better, but it's a little bit too wordy. I think we can get more concise with it. So let's cross that one out. We do is one user active. Should be waving red flags in your head right now if you see this one. Why would this one be red flaggy in your head? Exactly. So the condition that we are trying to test for is return true if at least one user is active. But with this particular variable name, this is very confusing. It's a lie. It says, is one specific user active, or is it what else we are trying to convey? So this toes the line between it's kind of concise and it could be correct, but it's not actually what we're trying to convey. So we're going to cross that one out as well. Another one is some user active? So this one's a little bit better, and in JavaScript, it follows the array.prototype.sum convention, but we're going to cross this one out because there's one more that is even better, that fits all three C's, and that's, is any user active? Is any user active? This would fulfill our condition. This does convey at least one, and this is much easier to read within the condition. So is any user active fulfills all those three C's. Next, we'll go to integers. And I apologize if some of this is very much known to you, but we have a lot of different names here. Yes? Has active users. That works. That follows our convention. This is one. Good job. Thank you for that. Has active users would also be one. So going back to integers, things that are understood. Oh, I was saying, I apologize if you may know this already, but this is either going to be a really excellent refresher, or you can send this to someone who has terrible naming and say, watch this. So things that are understood to be numbers. They're counts or a number of something. So there are ways to just name the integer itself, because we intrinsically know that it is a number. So things like age or year, or maybe we have a constant that says these are the maximum amount of login attempts, or we have tooltip delay in milliseconds. You'll notice that we get more granular, more explicit, more detailed in the examples that I share, because the initial ones are like, yeah, we know age is typically an integer, but we want to get to the very end. We want to be that explicit. We want to say what it is that we're trying to convey. Or we could say number of something. So number of retries, number of descendants, number of accounts, or number of days without rain. When you have to have a number of something, maybe you are using this in a total, or maybe you are needing to have a count of this. This is a good pattern to use. Sometimes you have something that is a little bit fleeting, like those temporary variables where you are in the middle of counting. So maybe you have a failure count. This is an alternative. You have failure count or retry count, or maybe current cake inventory count, which mine is always going up. And so now we come to another one. So if we want to return the number of eligible discount items that are part of a customer's order, this is something that was used. So this is very, very explicit. And who here has heard of the German naming convention? Yes, my man. So this would be a very great example of the German naming convention. There is a programmer in a blog post, I believe his name is Chris, I think last name starts with an S, but they talked about this story where he had a German colleague, they're both developers, and whenever he would review his code, he would be frustrated, but he would also be happy. Because whenever he would read his German colleague's code, it was so verbose, but he knew what he was talking about, because his variable names were usually this long. So while there is an argument to say it could be this long, I think we could make this a little bit more concise. So first, we can contract that within transaction to in transaction, right? We can save a few characters there. Then, depending on the context, we know that we are in this transaction. We can actually remove in transaction and just go to number of eligible items. Now, most people would call it a day and say, hey, this is short, this is descriptive, it's correct, it's giving us what we want, but I'm going to argue and say we actually want something like this. number of eligible discount items, because it's very clear that you're talking about discount items. What if in the future you have another thing that is an eligible item? Maybe it is a campaign that you say only specific campaign items are eligible. Or let's say something is not part of the original store. Maybe it's a pop-up store, and you say these items are not part of the main inventory. That could also convey the notion of an eligible item, which would not fit in the future. So another great thing about this is that while it's a little bit more work, if you do think forward and you think you may have to refactor it because it doesn't convey the right concept in the future, you can refactor it to something like this where it is more explicit. But if you start out with it in the first place, then you know you are very specifically talking about discount items here. And so this one would be the winner for here. Now we talk about floating point numbers, so unrounded measures, numbers that are not integers. And these are pretty self-explanatory in a sense. So floating point numbers, again, are like integers. Most of the ones that we know, we kind of know intrinsically that they are a floating point itself. So height, weight, price in Danish krone. Is it krone or krone? Krone? Krone. This is beyond the internet, so someone can phonetically spell it out in the comments if I said it right or not. Angle in degrees, or getting to that very specific, very concise name, high temperature in Fahrenheit. When you read a name like that, you know exactly what you are talking about. There's no room for misinterpretation. There's no room for error other than maybe you not understanding a particular word there. But it's very unlikely that you're going to not know this. Maybe here you'll be like, Fahrenheit? What is that? So maybe you would refactor that to centigrade, Celsius. Something amount. Similar to our integers, if the floating point itself does not convey as much as you need to, you can use this pattern as well. So maybe you have a discount amount, or maybe you have a transfer amount, or a refund amount. These are things that, again, are just a little bit more explicit when you add the name amount because you are dealing with it in this nature. Strings. So we are all familiar with this. They are typically a sequence of characters. And again, they are fairly good at being used as a variable name itself. So whatever the entity is that you are discussing, you can use that name. So full given name, or city, or short speaker biography, or player selected class if you're in a video game, or definition. Most strings really, really convey what it is that we're trying to talk about. The more explicit that you can be, the better it is that the fellow developers that you are writing code for will understand what you are talking about. And there's different degrees to which you have to be explicit, right? If you are within a class and you are already knowing that you are talking about a person, you don't have to duplicate the name person in the variable name. You can just eliminate that because you are within the context. However, if you're outside of that and you need to still convey the notion of a person, then maybe it would be good to add person there. But again, person is a very ambiguous name. You want to be very explicit. You want to say who it is that you're talking about. Is it a person, or is it a pro-tier member? Is it a sysadmin? There's all kinds of people in the world, so use your words and be more explicit about who it is that you're trying to talk about and what you're trying to convey. And sometimes we need to parse things as strings. So this is a good way to denote that when you have to use this. So you want to make sure that, I know a lot of us say we are not supposed to tie the implementation to it, but there are circumstances where we need to parse something as a string. So indicating that, for example, month as a string or time zone as a string. These are very common things that sometimes we would need to parse as a string, but in the moment when you're writing that and you are in the context of that, you're like, yeah, it's the month. I know what a month is, and I know that I'm just parsing it out to fill this particular component to say the month in a string format. But when you leave this context and you give this to your fellow developer, or you yourself return 3 months from now, you're going to want to know why this is returning as a string. Or maybe you still know it, but again, why give yourself that extra cognitive load of remembering what it is that you were trying to do? It takes you a few more characters to just say as a string and to do it. Collections are another very common thing that we need to deal with. So these are anything that is a group of things, arrays or lists or sets. And so, again, very similar to strings, except it's in a plural format because we want to convey that it is a group of a particular thing. So there's robots, there's sentient robots, there is discounted products, customers, or newly released books. These are all examples of, depending on the context, pretty good names for variables that convey what it is that we're talking about. Sometimes we need to talk about the implementation of it. So we talk about the implementation of things. So let's say you bring back an unordered list of customers because in a particular page, you don't care about alphabetizing them. You just need, here's a list. Give me everything that we have. So you may want to convey that. You want to say, this is an unordered list of customers. Or you may want to pass that on and say, hey, when you are dealing with this particular piece of information, it's not ordered for you, so here you go. Or you want a queue of first priority tasks, or you want an ordered set of timestamps. Again, in the moment, it seems like overkill. In the moment, you have that context in your head, and you think, oh, I have to write out a couple more characters and really explain this. But you will thank yourself later for being this explicit, and your fellow developers will thank you, and people you've never met who decide to take over the platforms and the applications that you're working on will thank you because you were so explicit. So continue to err on the side of being more explicit and more descriptive than not. Maps are another common thing when we access values by keys. And so a very good pattern to follow is key to value map. So what it is that we are trying to access by the key. So if we had a book and we wanted to find the author, book ID to author map. If we wanted to find all of the order counts by customer, customer to order total map. Or if we wanted to get a list of suppliers for the products that we have, product ID to suppliers map. It's very, very intuitive when you read it. Someone who has never been in that code base before can get a better sense of what it is you're trying to do here. And again, it just all comes down to being more explicit. Same thing in pairs and tuples. So this is one that I get a lot of pushback on because it's kind of long, but I'm going to argue and say it has helped me time and time again, and it is just more explicit. So pairs and tuples, and it could be more, but these are things that are typically stored together. So pairs, 2 things, or tuples, 3 things, sometimes more things. So for pairs, we do first pair and second pair. So length and width, sets and repetitions for exercises, current and lifetime XP, genus and species. Now, someone once said, well, why do you have to have the and? It's pretty self-explanatory. You're making it a little too long. Can't you just do length, width, or sets, repetitions? You could, but it's a little bit harder. And when you talk about the third example, current and lifetime XP, if we did that, current, lifetime XP, now it gets a little bit confusing. What are you trying to convey? Are you talking about the current lifetime XP of this particular user for this session? Or are you trying to convey something else? We are trying to convey something else because this is a pair. We're trying to convey the current XP the player has right now and the lifetime XP. So this is why I say keep the and in there, especially when talking about pairs and tuples. For tuples or anything more, first, second, and third thing, or and fourth thing. So as you have more things that you are grouping together and you need to name, you would just remove the and. You wouldn't do first and second and third and fourth. You would not do that. You would only do it right before the last item. So for example, you do height, width, and depth in centimeters, or saturated, trans, and total fat in grams. Or for color pickers, red, green, blue, and alpha. These are all really legible. These are all very clear what it is you're trying to convey, and you may even have a notion of what function this might belong to or what parameter this might be just reading these names, because they are a bit more explicit than the average variable. That is true. I'll end with this. We've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about synonyms, homonyms, homophones, homographs, skull, squall, tayo, tayo. We have so many different names, so many different words that we can use to describe our world. And so when we think about that and we start choosing identifier names for our programs, the one thing I want you to remember, because there's so many other quotes and maybe I'll get listed somewhere on the internet, great code is understood. Rarely is it interpreted. If you keep that in mind and you choose your identifier names that are correct, concise, and consistent, then I can assure you the variable names you write will not have you shaking your head in the end. Thank you so much. So, very quickly, am I still on? Yeah, they didn't cut me off yet. Salamat means thank you in Tagalog, tak. So just very, very quickly, if you do like this, please forget to rate my talk, put the little cards in. If you enjoyed this, that is my Twitter. If you're on there, X, whatever you want to call it, tweet about it, share about it, let my boss know I'm actually here and doing a talk. And one last thing, because I didn't do any of it in the beginning, but oh, well, that too. If you please find me. If you know a good patisserie or bakery, I am all about sweets. So if you know any here, please find me. I want to find it before I leave. And I'm currently writing a book called Looks Good to Me, Constructive Code Reviews. So if any of how I've explained variable names was interesting to you, I would love for you to check it out. I talk about how to make code reviews much better, much more humane, much more compassionate, but I also talk about how we can make them more manageable. If it takes too long, what do you do to not make it so long? Why are we not using more automation to get rid of silly comments like indentation, spacing? Those should not be in there. I talk about a whole bunch of things about code reviews, and I'd be really happy if you just checked it out. And I am truly done now. Thank you.